Hello, I'm Michael Hryschenko, and I'm the author and narrator of the Democracy Undecided channel, which explores democracies through simplicities, what democracies really means, and why they never settled. Today we are going to review the framework that I have developed as the analytical foundation for the Democracy Undecided project, which aims to help audiences understand what democracies looks like in practice, what conditions sustain it, and how it changes over time. Rather than ranking countries or promoting political outcomes, the framework is designed to help readers and viewers analyze their own systems, to recognize equilibrium, detect drift, and understand why certain patterns repeat across very different societies. This framework emerged from repeated attempts to explain democracy without reducing it to slogans, moral claims, or ideological positions. Public debates about democracy often collapse into polarized narratives: success or failure, virtue or corruption, stability or collapse. These debates generate conviction but rarely understanding. What is usually missing is a simple structural way to see how democratic systems actually function under pressure. The Hryschenko's democracy equilibrium framework is not an academic model in the formal sense, nor does it seek theoretical completeness. Its purpose is analytical clarity. The goal is to provide a small number of structural concepts that allow non-specialists to reason about democratic systems without requiring disciplinary training in political science, economics, or law. This work does not defend any country, ideology, or political system. It offers a way to think about democracy that is simple enough to be widely used, but precise enough to reveal why democracies stabilize, drift, or fail. This framework is a conceptual model developed for clarity and public understanding, not a literature review or empirical academic paper. In the next set of slides, we will consider the complexity of democracy and, in reality, the simplicity of democracy equilibrium framework and how to use this system in practice regarding to one of the democratic systems we have, namely Swiss direct democracy system. So this diagram that you see on this slide brings together everything we've discussed so far. Let's start at the center. The democracy equilibrium point exists when citizens, business, and government constrain each other. No force dominates, power remains reversible, and outcomes stay contestable. Now we move outward. The three internal forces are always active. Democracy is never static. Equilibrium is maintained through continuous tension, not harmony. Let's add filters. Short-term judicial filters absorb sudden shocks by enforcing rules immediately and predictably. Long-term legislative filters slow structural change through procedure, debate, and delay. These filters determine whether pressure is dissipated or allowed to accumulate. Now, let's add the external layer, external stressors: war, capital, mobility, platform, migration, climate, and energy shocks. They do not rule the system. They apply uneven pressure that strengthens one internal force more than the others. What actually causes drift is the interaction of three conditions. External pressure persists, one internal force gains a durable advantage, and institutional filters weaken, fail, or are bypassed. At this point, pressure stops being absorbed and starts being converted into the power. Why drift has a direction? Once imbalance begins, it follows predictable paths. Strength in government leads to authoritarian drift. Strength in business leads to oligarchic drift. Fragmented citizens lead to anarchic drift. Democracy does not randomly collapse. It slides along known routes. In conclusion, democracy is not destroyed by stress. It is destroyed when stress meets weak filters and asymmetric power. This slide explains what it looks like when the interaction we just saw does not break the system. From previous slide, we saw three core mechanics at work. External stressors apply pressure, internal forces respond asymmetrically, institutional filters determine whether the pressure bends or breaks the system. Dynamic stability is what exists when that pressure is absorbed repeatedly, not just once. Now the question becomes, when does the system actually hold? Dynamic stability exists when pressure is processed, diffused, and corrected, rather than amplified or locked in. Economically, this means growth does not outpace institutions or hollow out labor. Productivity gains translate into broad opportunity rather than permanent advantage. Competition remains real, labor standards are enforced, even under capital mobility, and distributional mechanisms prevent growth from becoming structurally extractive. Politically, stability requires predictable rule of law and peaceful rotation of power. Authority remains legally constrained, emergency powers are temporary and reviewable, and crisis measures decay automatically unless reaffirmed through normal democratic procedures. Power remains reversible rather than cumulative. Socially, stability requires that citizens accept procedures even when outcomes disappoint them. Trust remains above collapse thresholds, disagreement stays contained within institutional rules, and information integrity preserves a shared decision-making baseline despite polarization or stress. The key insight is this: stability is not equilibrium through stillness. It is equilibrium through continuous correction. A democracy near the democracy equilibrium point can survive wars, migration shocks, capital flows, technological disruption, and climate stress only if these pressures are filtered instead of translated into the permanent power shifts. And critically, stability fails not when pressure increases, but when correction slows. When institutions can no longer respond faster than advantage accumulates, drifts begins. Let's now have a look at the early warning signals that democracy equilibrium point is shifting. This slide clarifies what early warning signals actually are. And early warning signs are not random symptoms and not ideological signals. They're observable indicators that structural reversibility is failing. Earlier, we listed visible symptoms of democratic drift. Here, we explain why those symptoms cluster and what they signal structurally. The key claim of this slide is simple. Democratic drift does not begin with ideas or leaders. It begins when reversibility weakens simultaneously across economic, political, and social domains. First structural threshold relevant to growth without redistribution. Economic growth alone is not stabilizing. Growth becomes destabilizing when it concentrates power instead of diffusing it. When profits and assets values rise while wages stagnate, labor protection weakens, and social or geographic mobility declines, power steadily shifts toward capital, even if headline indicators look healthy. This process looks like that. Does not require corruption, does not require crisis, and does not require authoritarian intent. It occurs mechanically when market remains profitable but no longer contestable, and labor bargaining power erodes faster than institutions correct for it. Once growth becomes decoupled from redistribution and mobility, the system begins tilting towards oligarchic drift, even while democratic forms remain intact. At this point, stress is still partially reversible. The system is strained but not yet locked. The next slide explains what happens when political reversibility also begins to fail. So, this slide completes the picture by introducing the second structural threshold. Together, these thresholds explain why drift accelerates once it starts. Second structural threshold is relevant to emergency powers that normalize. Emergencies themselves are not the danger. Democracies routinely grant extraordinary authority during crises. The danger begins when temporary measures persist, emergency logic becomes routine, and executive discretion expands while reversal weakens. At this stage, courts may still exist, legislatures may still meet, elections may still occur, but effective reversal becomes politically or procedurally impossible. Democratic filters degrade quietly, not through abolition, but through normalization of exception. This is how systems slide toward authoritarian drift without a clear rupture. The third structural threshold is relevant to trust that is falling below a functional minimum. So, as we said previously, democracy does not require consensus or harmony. It requires procedural acceptance. When trust drops below a functional minimum, citizens comply conditionally rather than normatively. Institutional outcomes are no longer accepted as legitimate. Enforcement becomes selective rather than general. At this point, courts retain formal authority but lose enforcement power. Media concentration accelerates narrative control. Capital flight threats begin shaping policy choices. Citizens disengage and radicalize simultaneously. This combination is particularly dangerous because institutions still exist, but their capacity to correct imbalance collapses faster than normal structures change. Now let's integrate why these signs matter together. All familiar warning signs, media concentration, capital leverage, polarization, disengagement, cluster around these three failures. Growth without redistribution, emergency powers without expiration, trust below the functional minimum. When this occurs simultaneously, the democracy equilibrium point is no longer oscillating, it is relocating. Thus, in conclusion, we can say that democracy does not fail at a single point. It fails when reversibility disappears, economically, politically, and socially, at the same time. Now, let's move our attention to the application of this democracy equilibrium framework to Swiss direct democracy. So, let's have a look at Switzerland in the context of the democracy equilibrium framework. Switzerland sits near the democracy equilibrium point, not because conflict is absent, but because conflict is institutionally contained and continuously processed. Citizens, business, and government can all act forcefully, yet none can dominate the system or lock in permanent advantage. Power remains constrained, contestable, and reversible through a dense architecture of institutions, federalism, courts, coalition governance, and direct democratic vetoes. Policy disputes exist constantly, but they are processed through procedures rather than imposed by force. Switzerland is therefore not an idealized democracy, but a high resilience equilibrium case in which drift is slowed because domination is structurally difficult. Switzerland's proximity to the democracy equilibrium point is not maintained by abstract principle alone, but by a dense web of reciprocal constraints operating across everyday political and economic interactions. Influence flows in all directions, between citizens, business, and government. Yet, in each direction, it encounters an institutional counter-pressure. Citizens constrain government through direct democratic vetoes, legal accountability norms, and frequent referendums that make executive authority conditional rather than absolute. Citizens also constrain business through high consumer expectations, reputational pressure, and labor voice that limit disposability even in competitive markets. Government authority over citizens is exercised primarily through predictable rule of law enforcement, with emergency powers designed to exist but resist permanence. Government influence over business is structured through stable regulations and competition oversight that prioritize continuity over discretionary interventions. Business influence over government is present, but diluted by federalism, coalition governments, and referendum risk, making regulatory capture costly and uncertain. Business power over citizens is further constrained by labor standards, bargaining institutions, and media pluralism that limit both economic and narrative dominance. Taken together, these 6 channels ensure that power remains active but reversible. No actor is neutralized, yet none can consolidate lasting dominance. This continuous balancing is what keeps the system oscillating near equilibrium rather than drifting under the pressure. What distinguishes Switzerland is not just institutional design, but the presence of amplifiers that make equilibrium effective in practice. Strong procedural norms among citizens raise tolerance for process and lower tolerance for chaos. High institutional quality ensures that laws are enforced predictably rather than symbolically. A comparatively higher trust information environment reduces the return on manipulation and outrage cycles. These factors do not create balance on their own, but they magnify the effectiveness of democratic constraints, turning formal rules into a lived reality. Switzerland's resilience to external shocks is not based on immunity, but on how shocks are processed through institutions rather than converted into the permanent advantage for a single force. In security and war-related crises, executive power is diffused through a collective federal council rather than a single leader. Emergency powers are time-limited, and parliamentary and popular oversight remain active, so measures adopted during crises such as heightened security or sanctions are expected to be rolled back once conditions normalize. During the energy and climate stress, Switzerland relies on long-term planning tools such as diversified energy imports, gradual expansions of renewable approved through local and cantonal votes, and price stabilization mechanisms, choosing institutional legitimacy over rapid but politically destabilizing central control. Demographic and migration pressure are managed through strong local implementation capacity, meaning municipalities handle integration, vocational training, channels migrants into the labor markets quickly, and wage standards reduce undercutting that would otherwise fuel social backlash. Across all cases, the same logic holds. Shocks apply pressure, but high administrative competence, predictable rules, and distributed authority prevent any single crisis such as war, energy, or migration from permanently shifting the democracy equilibrium point. Now, let's talk about the real fears for the democracies. The core mistake is thinking democracy dies from conflict. It doesn't. Democracy is designed for conflict. What democracies should actually fear is imbalance. When one internal force, state, business, or citizens, stops being constrained and becomes structurally dominant. External shocks, war, capital, mobility, algorithm, crises, they do not destroy democracy by themselves. They apply pressure. They stretch the system. These shocks only become dangerous when they amplify existing asymmetries. War strengthens executive power, capital mobility strengthens business leverage, platforms amplify citizen polarization, crises justify exceptional measures. The democracy equilibrium point is not a location and not a moment. It is a condition. Power remains contestable, constrained, and reversible. That condition must be maintained continuously, not assumed. Three internal amplifiers determine whether equilibrium holds under pressure, and those are information integrity, whether narratives are plural, accountable, and trusted, social norms, whether societies accept procedures over rage and losing over escalation, and institutional quality, whether laws are enforced predictably, not symbolically or selectively. But none of these works without systemic filters that resist permanent concentration of power. Short-term resistance comes from judicial filters. Courts that can immediately block executive overreach, rights that are enforceable even during emergencies, legality that operates in real time, not after the damage is done. And long-term resistance comes from legislative filters, separation of powers, veto points, sunset clauses, procedures that make it hard for temporary measures to become permanent structures. Democracies begin drifting when growth concentrates without redistribution. Emergency powers normalize, trust falls below a functional minimum, and power stops being reversible. Loud disagreement, protest, or polarization are not the danger by themselves. The danger is when losing becomes unacceptable and authority stops being constrained. The real fear is not conflict. The real fear is a system where no one can stop power once it starts accumulating. Now the model turns outward to you. Where is your country drifting? Towards balance, oligarchy, dictatorship, or chaos? Once you know which force is growing fastest and which channels are weakening, you can predict the direction of the drift.